How is slavery in Utah similar to or different from slavery in the South?
So when you look at the story of slavery in Utah Territory, we're looking at a group of about 100, perhaps up to 105 people, plus perhaps any enslaved people that were taken to Utah by military officers who we haven't been able to um, determine were there. Um, their lives in slavery in Utah Territory were very much the same as they were in the South. Utah in 1852 instituted a law called an Act in Relation to Service that um, had the purpose of gradually ending slavery, um, but was ignored by everybody in the territory pretty much. It gave enslaved people additional rights. They had to be educated, they had to have um, all the care that they needed. And of course, in the South, enslaved people could not be educated. It was against the law in most places for them to learn to read or write. However, even though that was the law in Utah, Alexander Bankhead and his wife Miranda Red Bankhead told a reporter in 1899 that slavery in Utah was just about like slavery in the South. They had no control over where they were. They had left their families in the South. They had no ability to go back there. They were isolated in a place that was hostile to being able to flee or leave. They wanted to be free and had to continue to serve as slaves. One of the factors that was different there, however, even though their lives were the same, they couldn't determine their own family structures or their control their labor or any of that. But one thing that was different was that most of their neighbors were from the Northeast or New England or Europe and tended to be horrified when they saw any of the worst parts of slavery, the beatings, the um, coercion that happened in slavery, and were not hesitant to tell the Southerners that. And so that would have exerted some form of control on how difficult slavery was. But at the same time, they were so isolated. Most of the young men, young women, depending on where they lived in Utah, had little to no chance to marry. It took many of them years until former Civil War soldiers made their way across the country to Salt Lake City, or until they moved into a community with another Black person. So the isolation was a major factor where it wasn't the same in the South.
Thank you so much, Amy, for that. What was the role of Black pioneers in shaping Utah's early settlements and any impact or influence that they had on agriculture?
First three enslaved Black pioneers to permanently settle in Utah, or temporarily in the case of those that went to California, were in the 1847 Pioneer Company with Brigham Young. They arrived in the Salt Lake Valley 2 days before Brigham Young did, actually. Their names were Green Flake, Hark Wales, and Oscar Smith. And they got there and immediately started exploring, helping lay out properties, building farms, building homes for their enslavers who were still to come the next year. They helped build the fort. They're on the records of the men that helped build the fort, the Pioneer Fort, that's on the site of what's now Pioneer Park in Salt Lake City. Then when their enslavers arrived the next year, and most of them moved to the mouth of Big Cottonwood Canyon, South Cottonwood, or Lyman Survey settlements in South Salt Lake County. They built their own farms, helped with herding large numbers of cattle, and they also had goats that they used for milk. So they would have grown market gardens as well as worked in what was called the big field. Mormon settlements were usually built together with all the homes together, and then the men would go out, and women in some cases would go out and work in what was called the big field, or the name of the town field. And so there's references to these three men and later others going to work in the field. So they would be doing fencing, putting up fencing, planting crops, clearing brush. And then, of course, the women, enslaved women, would have been taking care of households, doing laundry, etc., and also helping turn the large amounts of milk from the livestock into um, cheese and butter to preserve it.
How can people today engage with and honor the history of Black pioneers in Utah?
For anyone that has read my book, you've seen a set of two images in the introduction. The first one from a 1890s publication by the Relief Society shows a Relief Society meeting house, and that's where the basketball um, arena now is. And in the picture of the Relief Society Hall, you can see a number of figures, a few white people, a black woman in the center, a black man on the side, and some black children on the other side, all standing there for the picture. Well, the Relief Society wanted to use that picture again 50 years later for another publication. At that time, they had somebody do some photo editing and replace every black face with a little white face with very primitive photo editing. So you look at those two pictures and you can see, if you look carefully, all those little replacement white faces, they literally removed the black people from the history. And that's really what's happened. There was a conscious effort to take those stories out. There were only a few minor efforts to record the stories and restore them in any way before recent years. But in recent years, there have been many amazing efforts to start telling those stories again, whether on Century of Black Mormons through the University of Utah or the Black Heritage Organization in Utah, Sama Hadithi, or families telling their stories, trying to figure out what had actually happened, like with the Red Family Organization has worked with Tanya Ryder for more than a decade to repair the family history, to fix those stories that had been told, to make them truthful. So in the effort to recover or restore this history, there has to be an admission that it was told wrong, whether that was just errors of memory, whether that was literally whitewashing the history, whether that was just segregating any history that existed. If you look at the Brigham Young monument that was on Temple Square, it had a plaque with all the names of all of the members of that first wagon company. And down in one corner, separated by a little color line, were those three enslaved pioneers, Park and Green and Oscar. So rather than segregating that history out, rather than whiting it out, um, just being respectful that it actually did exist. And in the integration, we might need to even overemphasize it a little bit while we're trying to figure out how to reintegrate that into the story, and not just Black history, Jewish history of Utah, the Greek history of Utah, whatever it is, to be able to say this is not the story of the Mormon pioneers, New Englanders and Europeans and nobody else. as it's often been told. So the integration, being respectful about what's actually in the records versus some of the stories that were told in between.
Yeah, thank you so much for that answer. That is really compelling. And like the work that you've talked about that Tanya Ryder and Sema Hadithi and these organizations have done is so important. I have one more follow-up question. In your opinion, what do you hope will happen with these stories of Black pioneers? Like obviously you've created a book sharing their story, but what other ways do you hope their stories are spread? And for example, what can we do to further your work?
Literally just doing work on them. And if we have time, I'd love to hear about your more about your project and what you've uncovered so far. So having these university papers, high school students writing about the history, elementary school children having coloring pages about Green Flake. Recently, Mally Junior Bonner um, spearheaded putting three statues of Jane Manning James and either one or two of her children, and Green Flake and Hark Wales and Oscar Smith. Um, Statues of those first 1847 settlers up at This Is a Place monument. So now anybody that goes to This Is a Place monument to explore the Utah's pioneer history or the Latter-day Saint pioneer history, whatever they're there for, when they enter the park, they pass those monuments, those statues of the Black pioneers. So having those stories out there, having the research out there is a starting point to be able to integrate this diverse history into all the ways the story is told.